Namaste and in-law catch. Hi, I'm Zen Benefiel, and welcome to this episode of One World in a New World. Now, the in-law catch and namaste are two terms from opposite sides of the world. The meaning is a similar thing. Namaste means the divine in me recognizes the divine in you. It's a Brahmi language, actually from Sanskrit, which is written language. And in-law catch comes from the Mayan, and it means I am another you. So imagine if we could just shift our consciousness and our appearance and our attention, intention, and interactions to that kind of perspective in life. It'll drastically change things, transform them. So this week's guest is Anton Chernikov, who's this brilliant social entrepreneur who lives in England. And he's in the process of, he's got a whole bunch of things going on, regenerative building or regenerative community building festivals. He's working with local investors and landowners to build co-working and incubator space and co-living regenerative communities actually in England or across England even. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation, I'm sure. Anton, Tony, welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Now, you've been involved at this for a little while. Obviously, you're still young in comparison to where I'm at, right? So it's really refreshing for me to see this kind of engagement in the community and the development. I'm curious, what kinds of things did you see in the world? What was going on inside of you? How did you find that ability to reflect your inner awareness and perspective into the things that you do and achieve what you have? Big question, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm very much at the beginning of my journey. I think that what I've always felt was the way that we, in particular, design our built environment actually isolates us and separates us and makes it more expensive and more difficult to actually live a healthy, happy, fulfilled life. Mm-hmm. And somehow there's a lot of things that we're kind of conditioned into: decisions, careers, choices, lifestyle, that actually makes very little sense if you zoom out and look at it.
When did that first begin to occur to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it became a lot more conscious in me, obviously, in my mid-20s, and that's shaped a lot of my career. But I do look back to when I was a kid, and we were a first-generation family moving from the Soviet Union, where I was born, into the West. Ah, there we go. I was born in Moscow.
Okay.
And one of the things that we kind of lacked was a real sense of neighborhood, a community, a sense of extended family. We very much were in a residential street. We had a driveway, a car, and actually we were incredibly isolated. Even though we were in a kind of suburban town and we had parks around, the reality is that, we didn't have that social fabric. And actually, I think that's something that, looking back, I really missed. And I think that there's also just so much of that suburban life that just doesn't make any sense. The broken housing model. Yeah, it's just that expectation that to have kids, you need to do the right thing and move out of the city, buy a car, buy a big house with a garden, and then there needs to be a room for every child. You need to work tirelessly to pay off the mortgage for this kind of suburban townhouse or whatever it is. And then you need these kids to go to the school, and you need to take them to the activities, and so on and so on and so on. And then
what occurred to you though early on in that, so you recognize as a child that you had this gap, right? Yeah. So how did that affect you in the process of, I mean, you seem like a very observant person because you're already looking at, okay, how life is and how do I feel like it ought to be and what's missing and what do I do about it, right? So when did that occur, and the ideas that came, and how did they come?
I mean, I think a lot of it was actually out when I left the schooling system, when I finished university.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that the way that we're educated today actually prevents us from questioning our world. It prevents us from...
Yeah, the kid with the question in class usually gets their hand slapped.
Yeah, exactly.
No, don't interrupt me.
And university isn't about observing the world and understanding the problems that exist and trying to find your own way of responding to them.
Mm-hmm.
Education is about following a process and then preparing yourself to enter into the workforce, into the industrial economy.
And occasionally, I've been through 2 master's degrees as well. And I agree with you, there's this structure, and occasionally you'll find an
awesome teacher that likes to break the rules and that kind of believes that it should be more than just this kind of like very...
The funny thing is in that
linear way.
Yeah. The funny thing is that you understand that rules are being broken when that happens. And so there's this program that comes up. It's like, why is this? Right?
I always liked breaking rules. I always thought that the teachers that didn't follow the system were the most interesting, and I learned the most from. I think, I never really admired or respected the system that I was in. Even though I got the A's and I got the grades and I ticked the boxes, there was within me the sense of there was something that this didn't matter. And I was just in this tick boxing exercise and I just needed to get through to the next stage. Sure. And it was only when I got out of university and I really had the ability to find my own way that I think I started to open up to whole new other ways of thinking and learning and experiencing the world. And I think where school really let me down was socially.
So your curiosity hadn't been diminished at that point. And that's kind of rare, right?
I think that there was something about school that was incredibly lonely. And I thought that not enough attention was given to teach us about our emotions and interpersonal skills and really learning to not just compete with each other on the sports field and in the classroom, but to engage in a relationship.
And now today we have a problem with video games and kids just becoming addicted to them and garnering no social skills from it whatsoever.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's also this very, very toxic kind of, I went to an all-boys school and that's never healthy. I don't think that boys and girls should be separated in education because they're not separated in life. I think that when you prioritize academic performance and testing over everything else, you end up with a very dysfunctional population.
Yeah.
And that, I think, was one of my frustrations, was that I actually was a dysfunctional human being. And I had to really unlearn a lot and go find my own way to get the learning that I needed to become a whole human being. Well, you give yourself time and you take lots of risks and you meet lots of people and throw yourself into uncomfortable situations, like going to a festival, like going to Burning Man, like and you kind of just wing it and hope you meet enough mentors and stumble into enough situations that you can kind of put the pieces together. Now, but it's a very inefficient way of doing it. And
but is it really though? Because this whole process, and maybe you can reflect on this, is generative, right? It's like you're stepping into the unknown. You're not really, you don't know what you're going to experience, but you have this attention on doing it, and your intention is to learn more, be more, find out more about yourself and others. And then the interactions take place from that. So it's kind of a flow.
But what is the purpose of structure? Yeah, exactly. But that would happen anyway. The failure of education is it's supposed to accelerate and catalyze that process, not prevent it and restrict it, right? It's the whole point of learning and education should be to shortcut the process, to speed it up, because otherwise we just go and learn by ourselves. And I think that there is a duty for within education to be a lot more holistic,
Right.
To make you aware of so many more things. And thankfully the internet does a good job, but actually you're discouraged from following an alternative path. Everyone should take a gap year, and everybody should set up their own projects. And I think that it's such a shame that we're kind of forced through this kind of testing system, only to go into a college environment, which is a very toxic, artificial bubble that once again doesn't prepare you for the real world.
Yeah.
And
it can be. Again, it depends on the professors and the students, and there's that opportunity that the self-initiating can still find.
And I think some people really like the structure, and some people really fit in with that. But I think that it's a lot easier to fit in if you are in a very healthy home environment and that you have that home experience. But I didn't. My parents got divorced. My parents were very young. They moved into a country where they barely spoke the language. It was very stressful for them. And so they barely had enough emotional capacity to support themselves and kind of get through. And, you arrive to a country with nothing, you've got to work hard and all those things. So, it's a lot harder to fill the gaps that school misses.
Right.
If you don't have that kind of very present, aware,
but you've overcome all of that.
Family.
You've overcome that. Because of that, you were kind of set up to do so, right? One of the things that you've done to help overcome that, you were one of the co-founders of Rebuild, which was initially a festival online, and that's how I found out about you, through Vic Dvorsky, and the presentation that I gave actually on holistic living, holistic education and village development, which it's still kind of ahead of its time because it includes the body, mind, spirit, and nature in the coursework and the development, the free play for the kids, the assessment of aptitude and attitude and proclivities early on. So, and this is one of the things that my wife Luba told me about in the Russian educational system that she grew up in. She was picked early, 5 years old, as a pianist, and so an accompanist, and she went through all the rigors and had all the education and went through conservatory, trained in pedagogy for music theory and teaching.
The conservatory system, very not good.
well for her though, it gave her even though she was a rebel, right? And that's understatement. She got what she needed. Now, when she went to Rome as accompanist for the choir, she decided, hey, I'm done with this. I'm going to America. And she went to the embassy and requested, filed papers, got permission within a week. But she had to wait a year to get the plane ticket to come here. And that was 1990. Now, the advantage over, from what she's telling me about how that, not that it's completely good, but the initial assessment of aptitude and attitude for the kids and what they may be good at, and then creating the process for them to unfold in it, right, is what we're missing here, and which is what I included in the overall scope of Spectrum Academy, which was the presentation I gave for your conference. So those kinds of things are there. And, like our conversation here, my hopes are that by having these kinds of I call them apocalyptic conversations, because they are really about uncovering and discovering new things and sharing them with others, so that we can all have the opportunity to become more aware of each other, create larger networks, get better connected, and do the things that are necessary to rebuild, right, coming out of COVID.
Yeah, of
right?
course.
One of the things that you mentioned was that this has created, coming out of COVID, has created a real opportunity for remote workers to think differently about how and where they're going to live. So how did this affect your development of what you're doing? Because you're kind of right in the cusp of that, or right in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, Rebuild was born out of projects that we were all doing. There was a group of 5 of us, and we were all working on our own place-based communities and researching these topics. And we thought, yeah, this was a great time to launch an online conference and physical gatherings and create a community of practice. Because
How did you
this
guys
actually,
come together to begin with?
oh, I mean, how does any people come together? It's, you know, throughout life, it's kind of a bit of luck and chance and just being interested in similar things. You know, I did a podcast and Sam also did a podcast, and then we connected. Victor, we met through a Teal for Startups group and had a few meetings in London and then became friends. And Nico is part of this Sandbox network and is on a similar path in the US. And so really we were all interested in the same topic, and we all had experience hosting events and building networks and communities. And so, yeah, it felt like a good fit. I think that what's Rebuild, I think, is a wonderful conversation, but the purpose of Rebuild is not just to have conversations.
Right.
It's to help accelerate projects and make it so that it's not just a scattering of a few eco-villages, but there are actually hundreds, if not thousands, of really pioneering, new age, forward-thinking communities and places around the world.
There were very few.
Yeah.
I just want to mention that back in 2000, when I built my first website, one of the things I did was I was looking at intentional communities, and I wanted to find out who was out there and just create a list. Well, there was maybe a dozen and a half at that time that were known enough to at least be on the internet, right? Because the internet still was early, or in its early stages at that point.
And thankfully, there are a lot of eco-villages, and that's great, and it's building momentum. I think what is unique about this moment is that now these eco-villages aren't just being started by very kind of counterculture, anarchistic people that are, you know, whether it's communities or whether it's kind of really kind of radical anti-establishment type of places. I think now a lot of people that actually are quite center ground, that are in the mainstream, that have professional jobs, that are working through the digital economy, are all coming to similar conclusions that actually our super screen-based urban lives are very stressful, and that we don't have enough connection to nature, and we don't have enough experience of community. And this is actually making us burn out. This is actually making our experience of life more challenging, more difficult. And, you know, in extreme cases, it's taking years off our life. And it's preventing us from living a happier.
Right. And so you're essentially taking but you're adding to the IBM smart cities concept, right? Only it's not just the technology that's connected, it's people that really make it.
Exactly. And if we are to live in a truly smart city, it doesn't mean lots of technology and concrete glass buildings. No. Actually, how do we come up with a lifestyle where we're actually able to enjoy more of life and actually thrive more as human beings? And I think that one of my conclusions is that it's not about being in the countryside or being in the city. It's about finding a way where you can have access to both. And there's something that the city gives, and there's something that the countryside and wild landscapes and farmland offers that is really special and innate to living a great, inspiring, fulfilling life.
Sure. So you mentioned serendipity earlier and coincidence. I'm not so sure there are any. We just don't see the deep connections of when it's happening, right? The nature of this, you know, it doesn't eliminate the cities or the urban structures or the the villages, what it does is it gives us opportunity to have a choice and think better about how we're going to not just create a sustainable world, but one that thrives. And in order to do that, then, I use the adage, I do a lot of business consulting and organizational development stuff. Happy people get more done with less supervision and will meet your expectations and beyond if you just let them. Right? You give them the space, you provide the opportunity, you give them the framework without any real parameters as to how, kind of like DHOC started with Visa, right? Where it's a flatline structure, chaotic system, where those who are self-initiating see what needs to be done, they step up to do it, and then others kind of figure out where they fill in along the way. It's a very organic process, just like nature. Right, we just don't recognize those things, and I'm sure you're well of the Gore Foundation and how they've developed this idea of, okay, the optimal number of people in one location is 150. Otherwise, you start losing connections.
Yeah, the Dunbar number and all
right?
these things,
And so those are things that, with all this knowledge we have, all these best practices, all of the information that's available, then how do we take that let me ask you specifically, how do you take all that and then put it into a framework or a package and make it available to others so that they can explore and distill what's in it for them?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and I think so much of what Rebuild can evolve into is us working on these blueprints. I think that it's important to try and break down the problem in some way, because it can become a completely overwhelming task of reimagining civilization in every aspect of how people live, work, and engage with the natural world. I think that I kind of like to say there is, that's how we broke it up in Rebuild, was there is nature ecosystem. So how the systems around food, farming, ecology, animals, the natural world, how we understand that, integrate with that, and that's one aspect. Then there's the built environment. So the energy, the infrastructure, the housing, the offices, and everything that goes around the physical shelter environment, village, city, neighborhood that we built. And we have a lot of kind of thoughts on how that can be done. And then finally, there is the cultural, governance, social aspect, and also financial. How do we organize ourselves as human beings and create culture and relationship, and then that will then feed into the rest. And yeah, I think that's a nice way of breaking it up.
Trust.
Yeah, right? And I think that it's one of the things that we're trying to do is kind of start to surface good best practices and knowledge around these things. But the best way of doing it is to learn it is to actually have a real case study, to have a piece of land or to have a project or a neighborhood where you can actually do experiments. So it's all well and good theorizing and talking about it, but how do we create regenerative neighborhood? Well, open a space and start really bringing people together, and in a small way, starting to gather learning and insight through action. And then in a similar way,
and it's not really
so much by actually having a piece of land and actually starting to map out how it can be transformed.
And so a lot of folks think that, maybe there's this, the push to do it, right? There's the excitement and the wanting to leap ahead. And yet in the organic process, there's the paradox of you got to go slow in order to go fast. And that in the evolution of what, once you bring those people together, there's a tendered process of how they interact with each other. And I term it as, how to get people, places, and things to work together better, right? So there's this process of nudging and nurturing and making other things that, seeing what's missing and being able to observe and interact in order to fill those gaps.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the best way to learn these skills is through engaging in these types of events, and actually, even if it's part-time, start to participate in projects,
right,
and observe what works, what doesn't.
Learn it and teach it.
Yeah.
And
I think the event can be a really good microcosm of a village, and actually can help you to, in a small way, get a taste of what collective living could be about, and how that kind of collaborative knowledge sharing and self-organization can take place.
right.
I would say that it can be very, very simple, which is the choices that we're encouraged to make simply are not very good at value for money, in terms of the kind of the mainstream, in terms of where we live, what we need to consume, what we need to make, how much money we need to make in order to sustain a comfortable life within that model, actually is not a very good deal. And it's kind of doesn't bring out our best.
Yeah,
it doesn't create
creates
well-being.
Opposing
Yeah.
Perspectives, because the old adage of do what you love and the money will follow. There's always been this disconnect in that, because that side of things has always been more from a creative standpoint. Whether it doesn't matter whether it's arts or culture or industry, right? It's that creative part of us that has been diminished across the board, right? Where major innovations have come from those who don't pay attention to that, who break through that ceiling of expectation, if you will, and are driven by their own passion, the 5 Ps, the patience, persistence, perseverance, passion, and purpose. Now there's a 6th one there, and that's practice, right? Which is what you're talking about, of just, going in and doing the work. I know my educational training, 40% of information that you receive is retained when you're in a passive position, which is sitting in the chair, right, in the classroom. 98% of it is retained when you teach it. So these are the things that, from a mentor standpoint, to be able to have those mentees or the people around you actually giving them the power to stand up and teach. Right, wrong, or indifferent, they're going to make mistakes. We learn through that process, but we don't learn anything if we don't step in and do it. So I really laud your efforts, or applaud to your efforts in doing so. Now, let's get down to the practical and pragmatic. Can you give me an example of what you've been doing so far, and maybe some of the key points of where you're finding bottlenecks at this point?
So I think that there were maybe 3 steps that I decided to take during lockdown. One was, I realized that this was the perfect time to actually open a space. Just as people were closing the space, their spaces, and kind of shutting down, I thought, well, maybe we could find a location and actually show that a different approach is possible. And very practically, I think that retail and commercial space is very inefficient because it only serves one function. So a restaurant is closed during working hours, or it's pretty empty during working hours. It's only at lunch and at dinner and at weekends that it has any business. Equally, an office, when it comes to lunch or evenings or weekends, is pretty much empty. You just go in there, put your computer, and so forth. Then there's also such a distinction that exists between social spaces and professional spaces. For some reason, we need to work in sterile glass boxes, and then we need to socialize in very dark, damp, somewhat dirty, and very, very, very claustrophobic kind of bars where the noise is too loud, and so forth. And I think that what I wanted to experiment with House of Transformation, which I can give a little whistle-stop tour of the space, turn the lights on at some point, is we wanted to experiment with a space that could be many, many different things. And it could become a dance floor, it can become a professional work environment, but it could also be a restaurant and also a place just for people to come and do art and play and hang out together. And that it could
truly
really serve these multi-purpose options, but also that it could be a space that tells a story. That you come in there and then you're connected with a whole wealth of narratives and blueprints and visions for what living and working could mean.
Sure,
and so it is your kind of bridge to that. So the first step was where we literally live directly below House of Transformation. So we found a space close to us which we can transform and make into a community hub, and where we could manifest and embody some of our deepest values, principles, ideas. And it's not huge, it's kind of like 1,000 square feet or 100 square meters, and it's close to home. And that was the first step. You know, where are you now, and what can you do around in the environment you're in? And then the next step was to launch the Rebuild Conference, which is what are we really passionate about, and how do we create this kind of global collective intelligence around these topics of regenerative living, regenerative agriculture, community housing, to try and tackle this kind of separation that we have within our world, and this kind of disconnect that is kind of quite systemic. And so launching that conference feeds so many ideas, right? And it also reminds you of how many people are thinking along similar lines and doing projects all around the world.
Well, and it gave the opportunity.
You don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
You can borrow from so many projects.
The folks that have been in the sequestering, you know, I told my wife at the beginning of COVID, it was like, okay, I hope that this obsession, self-hygiene, sequestration gets people to actually follow through with the standard behavioral mod program, right? Which is you get the external stimuli and it takes you inward eventually.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they start questioning who they are, what they believe in, what they want to do. And these folks that have had these concepts for a while, that have just been working on them diligently, and probably not too many people know about it, all of a sudden now have the opportunity with this virtual world that's been opening up to actually participate and find others and create this huge, in essence, new global brain where this thought atmosphere of possibility exists, and booster off, and then allows them to unify and organize in places like Rebuild. And so this is the leading edge of where we're going. And from my perspective, having studied, I'm kind of a cognitive scientist, if you will, and I've studied consciousness for a long time. This is the progress of how this inner desire to connect and unify and be an example of, which actually, when you're looking at quantum physics, this is quantum entanglement applied on the physical level, where this intention that magnetizes, right? And it opens up the airways, so to speak, for these further connections to take place, because people, their intentions are to look for them. And that's what they're designing. And so the interaction is taking a whole different level, first online. And from what I'm seeing developing, you guys are already in process in the physical application of it. And that appears to be,
and that's maybe where the third point would be is,
sure,
if you start with something small that's local to you to build community and to host conversation, you then also engage on a global level to make sure you're learning from that collective consciousness. And then one of the things that I think is a very overlooked possibility is the ability for people in the city to connect with landowners and estate owners. And rather than look to kind of buy castles or mansion houses or whatever, to actually look at farms. And farms in particular have been struggling for a while. They have mostly followed this kind of industrial model of kind of building more and more barns, more and more warehouses, and then to house the tractors and store the grain and all those things, that is damage the soils and is not very sustainable.
And
So
really
there's a
doesn't
massive
support the local populations
exactly.
with any foods.
Yeah.
Right?
So then there is a
elsewhere.
massive economic, business, and lifestyle opportunity to look for farms that are connected, not too far away from the cities that you love, because that connection to the city is really important, to establish partnerships. And that's what we did, is we opened the space, we launched the global network, but then we started to, or I started to take trips out into the countryside and meet farmers, meet estate owners, and talk
farmers,
about how we could.
Speaking of, farmers markets are on the rise.
Of course.
10 years ago, I think maybe 15 at the earliest is when they began here, and we've probably, and I live in the Phoenix area, we've probably got at least 7 or 8 different farmers markets that I'm aware of that have really been a substantial contribution to people who are looking for organic products and things that are grown.
I think that
with intention and love,
every country, of course, and every country is different. But I think there is a huge skills gap that exists within the farming industry, but also there is a massive real estate opportunity, because you can repurpose barns and buildings. Also, farms have a lot of the infrastructure that you need for housing development anyway. Plus, wouldn't it be amazing if your back garden was a regenerative farm? Nobody wants to live next to a toxic industrial cattle or arable farm with loads of machinery and loads of pesticides where everything is dead all around.
Right.
But if you begin a process of stopping that type of farming and replanting, reforesting, returning the natural beauty, suddenly that land, which would have been the most undesirable place to live ever, suddenly becomes one of the most beautiful and interesting and inviting places to live.
So you're following Bucky's advice, right? Don't fight it, create a better model that makes the old one obsolete.
And what I've noticed is there's a massive shift towards natural capital investment, regenerative agriculture, and that's wonderful. But there's an opportunity that comes as more farms shift to regenerative agriculture, which is they need to build more houses. And they need to attract more people that will work the land, but also would help with that transformation process. Because, and I like the agri-hood model, which is actually quite popular in the US, where it's not enough just to have a farm. You also need to have schools, and you need to have housing, and you need to have modern office space, and you need to provide space for innovation. And actually, in the same way that you're talking about moving from kind of very linear one-dimensional learning to holistic learning, we need to move from very linear one-dimensional farming and town planning into much more holistic models. And the agri-hood, or the agri-village, whatever you want to call it, within that, it's so important to think multi-generationally, and also to think about very flexible, adaptable space that can generate income from many different directions. And rather than just farming, you're also collecting rents, and you're also selling houses, and you're also launching businesses and building economy.
And
all of the above.
That comes out of, and I think you've started doing this or have been doing this for a while, like your initial team, where you bring the people with multiple skill sets, backgrounds, the interest levels, and you bring those people together to begin with in the design phase in order to work all these bugs out. One of the things I do, one of the other hats I wear is I'm a partnering session facilitator. What that means is I bring people, places, and things together for major construction projects and kick off this is pre-shovel, right? It's the plans, the contract's been awarded, and the teams come together, and so it's my job to get them all on the same page, work out issue resolution plans, goals, objectives, code of ethics, all those kinds of things. So bringing those people together prior to is where that creative energy can be fully present, and then of course it's, you know, the natural facilitators rise to the surface in that place, because it's a group led, and there isn't necessarily one person who's in charge. You're all part of that process.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, and then that ability to create instant teamwork across multiple professions and stakeholders is key. And I think that one of the things that is required in that is to be a little bit of a generalist, and to be aware of how things connect and how things impact each other, and to think at a systems level and to design at some systems level. And you know, very rarely does anyone in construction really pay any attention to agriculture at all. You know, and actually, you know, I start to see a really interesting integration now of tourism, education, housing development, rural regional economies, and obviously the internet and the digital side. And I mean, ultimately, there is a very simple problem that you're solving, which is you're helping people live healthier and more fulfilling lives. And being stuck in an urban environment, stuck in a car, commuting, being, you know, kind of crammed into a tube or a train, that doesn't make any sense. And we don't have to design our world that way anymore. And
well, and it's been effective for the old system. You know, there's two paradigms I see here, two agendas that are we're in a segue, and it's not just in what we're doing. It's across the cosmos, if you will, from the and this is not woo-woo. It's just where we're at, right? We're going from the Piscean to the Aquarian age, from very patriarchal managed age to now more matriarchal, emotional, feeling, sensing, co-sensing, co-presencing kind of thing, like the Sharma and Senge's work. There's this trickle down to the local levels where when we people like you and I, right, we're able to kind of see the big picture and know how to put the details together as project planners and managers. So what I've noticed, and I'm asking if you noticed this too, where the natural skills and abilities in those people kind of rise to the surface, and all of those things that are required in order for the project to progress are present. And when you're in that co-presencing and co-sensing place, it bubbles up, it emerges on its own. And it seems like magic, but from a structural standpoint of quantum physics and quantum entanglement, the system's got its own natural design. All you're letting happen or all you're doing is you're facilitating those energies to come together and coagulate, right? Kind of like a possibilities coagulator, where you're pulling these things together from your, you know, unknown places, right? Because you have the ideas that these people have the skill sets and things that are necessary in order to bring these opportunities to the table, but you don't know how it's going to evolve, right? So
yeah, I mean, entering into the unknown, solving complex, wicked problems requires some degree of leap of faith. I think that this type of systems thinking is trained very well through a freelance career, where you're constantly having to jump between projects, you're constantly having to take risks. You have the freedom to kind of like make mistakes. So that's great. What you often don't get as a freelancer is a support structure and mentorship and an organization around you where you can learn from the best. And so it's really important for that type of more entrepreneurial, more independent workers and remote workers to create community and to create places where you can also feel that you belong to a tribe or a larger entity, because it can be very isolating. Right. And so that's another reason why this movement is taking off, is because there's a lot of people that have earned financial freedom, but are lacking that sense of community and place. And yeah, I think that on a personal level, I think it's really interesting to learn about the farming business and rural economies. And I think it's so much fun to transform a physical space, but to actually play and transform landscape and even kind of farmhouses and buildings and cow sheds,
Right.
and the imagination that unlocks is just so much fun. And I think there's definitely this question that should be asked more and more, which is, why do we live the way we live? And
you mentioned two things.
How do we want to live? How do we leave the old way and
right.
step into something new?
You mentioned two things that I think are key in that. The first was, and you didn't really give it much airtime, was faith, right? It's a leap of faith. And the second is play, right? When you're in this creative, there's this, it's a childlike attitude of not knowing what you can't do and just jumping in and playing and exploring with as much fearlessness as possible. Because there are going to, you're going to run into some reticence and things like that. But with this, and your generation especially, in my time, we were, I'll put it this way, in the traditionals time, it was find a job, go to work, retire, right? Stay with the same company. In my generation, then it switched to now, when I was getting my MBA in 97, the average person went through 13 different career shifts at that time.
Yeah.
So that set up your generation, or upcoming generations.
We have hundreds of projects.
Yeah. So what I'm illustrating there is the natural progression of how generations and what they've experienced have been prep work, right, so to speak, in order for this new wave of multidisciplinary, multifaceted, multinational endeavors that are occurring and bringing people together that never thought they'd be able to just a few short years ago.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the amount of projects that are started and initiated and conversations and threads. And I think that there is a completely different way of working that emerges when you think at a systems level. And that maybe because of one connection and because of one relationship or insight, suddenly something that wouldn't have worked suddenly becomes possible.
Right.
And you never know what's going to be ahead of you. But I found that beyond all of the kind of randomness that life brings, it is still important to kind of cultivate an intuitive sense.
There's a golden thread.
What matters most to us.
Sure.
And yeah, I think there's definitely, for me, a real love for creating spaces and building, architecting and building kind of beautiful things, and imagining how how the world could be.
Sure. The Imagineering process is
fun pursuit, and that never left me really. It's always been with me, even if it wasn't cultivated so strongly in education.
So let's look at it from your personal space and what you might be able to offer to others who are doing similar things or even thinking about it. What are some of the simple observations or points of awareness that you've garnered that you could offer for others to reflect and maybe empower their own journey?
I think building networks is quick and easy, but building community is slow and deep. With Rebuild, we've built a network. I hope that through House of Transformation and also Home Farm and the village we're creating in the UK, we can really build a community.
Right.
And the network is fantastic for collective intelligence. It gives you a lot of energy and inspiration. But actually, that community, that tribe, is what enables you to really live in an incredible way and to create things that last. And that's important to recognize. And we can get lost in mistaking networks for communities. And that's where we end up feeling quite isolated and alone, and surprised that we're isolated and alone because we have so many people that we're interacting with. But without that sense of place, that physical intimacy, that sense of creating something together in the physical, not just the digital, I think we can kind of lose ourselves and we can feel burnout quite quickly. So yeah, to really think about that balance between what energy you give the network and the global versus how much energy you give to the local and your immediate relationships and your immediate home environment and the place that you really want to dedicate yourself to. So that's one thing. I would say that I always say you don't need to be a billionaire to create your own world, your own place. You can partner, and finding creative ways to build partnerships with people that have assets that, such as land or buildings that you could lease or rent, and a lot can be achieved by
just creating
establishing a
conversation.
vision, but not just creating conversations. Actually, moving from the conversation into something, listening carefully and being creative in how then you transform that into shared value, into a very clear path towards something, because you can have lots and lots of conversations and then go round and round.
Well, my point was that you have to have the conversation first, right? You have to reach out.
Oh yeah, of course.
And create that.
And I think that in many ways, doing something, however small, is way more powerful as a business card or as a pitch than saying lots of things. Anyone could create loads and loads of Google Docs, and throw loads of information out there. But the willingness to distill that into what really matters and to have a clarity of thought so that you're not just jumping around everywhere.
Right.
I often...
So how do you handle for example, and again, accolades on Rebuild, and yes, there's a very strong network there. I've looked through, there was 40 some odd presenters, and so
there was 100 sessions and
okay,
so 700 people.
All right, so looking at that from that perspective, even for the presenters to have the time, because they're doing their own work, right? And so there's this, all right, how do I create the time to explore others and find out more about what they're doing and how it might impact me, or how I might be able to get involved, or them with me, and whoever that may be. So there's this perspective of time management.
Yeah.
Right now, the interesting point, and I'm going to jump off the cliff for just a second, I do quite easily. There was a guy in Canada in the 1950s that was the head of their UFO investigation program, who had conversations with people from elsewhere. One of the things that they told him is that time is a measurement of the change of entropy. Right? So, and let's say this is an advance of consciousness. We don't necessarily understand what the heck that really means, but an example of it is when you're doing things that you love, and like Csikszentmihalyi writes in Flow, the Psychology of Optimal Experience, when you're in that place of doing what you love, you're in the gamma zone, your time disappears, you're in this creative space, and it's just wonderful, right? So as you're developing, and I see these as more harmonious relationships, back to the two agendas I mentioned briefly, we're coming out of a profit over people and planet, and we're moving into a people and planet over profit. And in that segue, this kind of time truncation takes place because of the resonance that these types of events and networks and communities begin to develop, and things that might have seemed at one time to take forever are suddenly available in much less time.
Okay.
That's kind of a perspective, and of course these discussions are just beginning now. So maybe 10 years from now we'll look back and go, that was really interesting, and here's what happened as a result, right?
Yeah,
those kinds of things, because we're still looking at this vision of harmony among people and planet, and how do we work together best and provide for each other, not necessarily in where kind of like Atlas Shrugged, where it's not a selfish thing and it's not necessarily a selfless thing, but it works in tandem so that everybody has an opportunity to participate.
Yeah, for sure. And how to create more participatory places and cities and, and communities is important, and we haven't necessarily been very good at that. We've been very good at distracting people, not necessarily engaging them. But yeah, I think that there's something really worthwhile in challenging yourself to imagine what your ideal village would be like, and to that process of kind of imagining and working through kind of utopian scenarios is a very healthy process. It is
And
a great way
utopia
to
doesn't mean the absence of conflict either. A lot of times people hear utopia and it's not the British or the American TV series, right? But it's this idea of some kind of bliss, space. And that's really not what it is, because I
mean, maybe a better way of framing it is inspired futures and new possibilities. When you identify what might be broken and what might be challenging within your current way of life, it's really helpful to open up to new possibilities. And,
well, it may not be broken either. That's an attitude or belief system that we've gotten from the mental health system. We're not broken. We just need to adjust things a little bit to be more in line with our natural design.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I think there is a big opportunity right now to really ask a lot of profound questions about how we live and how we work. And it's exciting to know that, that actually you don't have to choose between the city and the country. You don't have to choose between working in IT and building a farming enterprise. I think that we can have multiple careers across multiple industries.
Right. There's a bridging of worlds.
Yeah, and that can actually, and that can be great fun, and that can also be very meaningful and well paid. And absolutely. Yeah, I think that we've had a educational system that has siloed us, that is focused on specialisms, and now we need more holistic thinking and more people that can understand the relationship between different systems, and can use their creative capacities to imagine new ways and actually build them.
New millennial Renaissance people, right?
Yeah, and I think that you've always, there's the cycles within history that flow between kind of more, I guess, in more production focused, and then more romantic, and you kind of flow between those two quite a lot. And yeah, I think that it's important not to get too lost in the big picture, and to still come back down to the simple things we do every day: the home, the bedroom we have, the home that we create, the people that are in our neighborhood, and not to get lost in lots and lots of meta conversations. And I think that it's really important to have that balance of a grounded life
Right.
but a connected one. And I think
Cool.
that's my dream,
Well,
is to be able to harmonize those two things.
and what a dream it is. And I really appreciate our connection, and I would imagine it's going to grow over time too as well. And I appreciate your time, Tony. And I'm sure our viewers have gotten a mind full of things and possibilities to coagulate for themselves too.
Yeah, and please add the website, hotspaces.org and re-build.co and exponentials.co.uk. If people
I'll
want
have
to
all
learn
of
more.
those in the credits,
So,
so that description,
cool.
that people can go. So trust me, I'll
and I would really looking forward to. I'll watch your Rebuild talk about holistic education in more detail, and yeah, I'd be really interested to, if you could share more about your pedagogy and how you approach the design of these programs in schools, and
I'd love to.
That's an area of inquiry for me, for sure.
Future conversations.
Yeah.
Again, thanks so much for your time today, and thank you all for joining us in this episode of One World in a New World. Namaste, in la catch, and we'll see you next time.